Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, September 1971. The main demonstration arena holds 5,000 people when it's full, and today, it is full. Every seat taken by the time the base commander walked to the podium at 1400 hours. The arena smells like sweat and gun oil and institutional concrete, the specific smell of every large military space everywhere in the country, and the sound inside it is the controlled noise of 5,000 trained people who are here because they were told to be here, and who are waiting to find out whether the afternoon is going to be worth the time. Bruce Lee is standing to the left of the entrance, out of sight of the main floor, watching the crowd through a gap in the partition. He was invited 6 weeks ago by Colonel William Hartley, who runs the base's combat training division and who had seen a martial arts demonstration in California in the spring, and had spent the following weeks making the case to his superiors that exposing 5,000 Marines to a different framework for thinking about personal combat was worth a Thursday afternoon. His superiors had eventually agreed, with the specific reluctance of people who are agreeing to something they don't understand, in order to stop a conversation they are tired of having. The invitation was for a demonstration and a discussion. Not a seminar, not a replacement for existing training, just an afternoon where 5,000 people could watch something done at a serious level and form their own conclusions. Bruce had conditions, as he always did. He wanted to watch the training that was happening before he arrived. He wanted an hour in the observation gallery, not announced, just watching, before he came onto the floor. He said he preferred to understand who he was talking to before he talked to them. Hartley agreed without hesitation. So Bruce had spent the previous hour in the observation gallery watching 5,000 Marines run through close combat drills, watching the specific quality of focus they brought to physical work, watching the instructors correct and the trainees adapt, and the whole organized serious business of people learning to use their bodies under pressure. What he saw was real. The drills were built around genuine principles. The instructors knew what they were doing. The training was serious, in the way military training has to be serious, built for use rather than for demonstration. He found this genuinely instructive and was still thinking through what he had observed when the base commander began speaking and 5,000 people went quiet. He did not see Staff Sergeant Dana Merritt until the base commander had finished the introduction and Bruce had begun walking toward the demonstration floor. She was standing near the front of the crowd, which was arranged in a rough oval around the floor space, and she was the person whose stillness stood out most from the controlled general stillness of 5,000 military people being professionally attentive. Where the people around her were still in the way. People are still when they are waiting. She was still in the way. People are still when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the moment to execute the decision. She was 29 years old, 5'10", 175 pounds, the specific 175 pounds of someone who had been doing serious physical work every day for 10 years, not the weight of someone who lifted weights in a gym, but the weight of someone whose body had been built by use. She had been a Marine for 10 years. She held the base close combat training record, which she had set 11 months ago against an opponent 60 pounds heavier than her. She had been a competitive boxer in the years before she enlisted and had continued training all the way through. Nobody at Camp Lejeune had beaten her in any kind of physical exchange in the last 3 years. The people standing near her knew who she was. The people standing near them knew who she was. The specific radius of awareness that strong people create in any large group extended outward from her position through the crowd. Bruce noticed her when he was 20 feet from the demonstration floor. He noticed the quality of her stillness. He noticed that she was watching him the way trained fighters watch things, reading rather than observing, finding information rather than receiving impressions. He noticed that she had not accepted his presence yet. She was still forming a verdict. He walked onto the demonstration floor and the base commander said his name into the microphone, and 5,000 people responded with the applause of a large crowd that had been told this was someone worth responding to, and was performing that response professionally. Bruce acknowledged it briefly and began. Subscribe right now. What happens 12 minutes into this demonstration is the thing that changes the entire afternoon. He started with principles, which was always how he started. Not techniques, principles. The relationship between timing and distance. The difference between responding to what someone was doing and responding to what they were about to do. The specific quality of attention that made the difference between seeing a technique and seeing its origin. He demonstrated these things on a training partner he had brought, a young practitioner named Marcus, who trained with him in Los Angeles, and who was there specifically to provide the real resistance that a demonstration without real resistance couldn't honestly claim. The demonstrations were clear and specific, and the 5,000 Marines watching them had enough training background to recognize what they were seeing. The crowd's response was genuine, not enthusiastic in the way civilian audiences were enthusiastic, but attentive in the way military people are attentive when they recognize that what they are watching contains something they can actually use. Bruce was 12 minutes into the demonstration when Dana Merritt spoke. She did not raise her hand. She did not wait for an invitation. She spoke from her position in the crowd, with the volume of someone accustomed to being heard in large spaces. She said, "What you're showing is rehearsed." The arena went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when something unscripted has been said into a large space. 5,000 people absorbing the sound of it, registering what it meant, waiting to see what happened next. Bruce stopped. He looked toward the voice. Dana was already moving out of the crowd toward the front. She said, "Your partner knows what you're going to do. The techniques look impressive because he's falling at the right times. Real resistance doesn't do that." Colonel Hartley, standing at the side of the demonstration floor, took a step forward. Bruce held up one hand. He looked at Dana. He said, "Your name," she said, "Merritt. Staff Sergeant Dana Merritt." He said, "What you're describing is a real concern." She said, "I'm not describing a concern. I'm describing what I see." He said, "What would real resistance look like to you?" She said, "Someone who's actually trying to stop you. Not someone who's been trained to cooperate with your demonstration." He said, "And you'd like to be that person." She said, "I'm not looking for permission. I'm asking if you're willing." Hartley said, "Staff Sergeant." She didn't look at him. She was looking at Bruce. Bruce said, "What do you actually believe about what you've been watching?" She said, "I believe you're very skilled at what you've been trained to do in the conditions you've been trained to do it in. I don't know whether any of it works outside those conditions." He said, "That's an honest statement." She said, "It's an accurate one." He said, "You have a background in boxing." She blinked. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "The way you stand, weight distribution, the specific way your hands are positioned right now, at rest, not raised, but positioned." He said, 10 years, I'd guess. Started before you enlisted." Something moved through her expression, not softness. Recognition. She said, 11. He said, "The question you're asking is whether what I've developed works against someone with real training and real resistance. That's not an insult to the demonstration. It's the right question." She said, "Then answer it." He said, "How would you like me to answer it?" She said, "Stop demonstrating on someone who cooperates and demonstrate on someone who doesn't." He said, "All right." 5,000 Marines produced the sound of 5,000 people understanding simultaneously that the afternoon had become something different from what they had been told it was going to be. Like this video right now, because what Bruce says before they start is something that 20 minutes later, nobody in that arena has forgotten. Hartley was on the floor now, speaking quietly and urgently. He spoke to both of them, first to Dana about the professional context and the appropriate channels and the fact that she was a staff sergeant and not a guest, and then to Bruce about the insurance considerations and the liability and the fact that this was not a sanctioned exchange and that he personally was going to be explaining this to someone above him regardless of how it went. Bruce listened to all of this and then said, "Colonel, what would be more valuable to these 5,000 people? Watching something that confirms what they came in expecting or watching something genuine?" Hartley looked at him. He said, "That's a question I can't answer in a way that helps my afternoon." Bruce said, "I know. But it's the right question." Hartley looked at Dana. He said, "Your call." She said, "I already called it." Hartley looked at the 5,000 people who were waiting. He made the specific decision of someone who has understood that the situation has moved past the point where his decisions are the primary factor. He established terms: no strikes to the throat, no eye attacks, no strikes after a person was down. The base's training referee, a compact man named Willis, who had been officiating combat training for 12 years, stepped onto the floor between them. Willis looked at both of them. He said, "This stops when I say it stops." They both acknowledged this. They found their positions. Dana settled into her boxing stance, the stance of 11 years, everything exactly where it had learned to be. Weight forward on the balls of her feet, hands at the correct heights, chin protected. She was technically excellent. Anyone watching who had training could see that immediately. Her stance didn't contain a single unnecessary element. Bruce stood the way Bruce stood. She looked at his stance and said, "That's not a boxing stance." He said, "No." She said, "That's not a wrestling stance." He said, "No." She said, "What is it?" He said, "You're about to find out." Willis raised his hand. He dropped it. Dana came forward. She came with the controlled aggression of someone who had spent 11 years learning exactly how to close distance behind a jab and what came after the jab when it landed. She was fast. Genuinely fast, the kind of fast that comes from drilling the same motion thousands of times until the motion costs nothing in terms of thought. The jab arrived where Bruce's face had been. Bruce's head had moved 4 inches. The jab extended through nothing. His left hand came up and touched her extended arm at the wrist. Light contact, a notation. From that position, his right hand found her shoulder. 1.2 seconds. 5,000 Marines produced a sound. Dana recovered and came back immediately with a cross. She had expected to need to follow up from the jab, and she was already committed to the follow-up before the jab had finished missing. The cross carried her full weight behind it. Real punching power built from years of serious training. Bruce slipped it to his right, minimum movement, and from the slipping position his hand found the back of her shoulder. 2 points. 4 seconds. The arena had gone from its crowd noise into the specific quality of attention that happens when 5,000 trained people are watching something they need to pay close attention to in order to understand it. Dana stopped. She was breathing at the same rate she had been breathing when they started. She had thrown 2 real techniques and found nothing. She was too experienced to panic and too serious to pretend that nothing significant had happened. She said, "You're reading before I commit." He said, "Yes." She said, "What are you reading?" He said, "Your left shoulder rises slightly before your jab." About 1/3 of a second. It's consistent. She looked at her own left shoulder. She worked it slightly, unconsciously, testing this description against her own internal memory. She said, "I've trained for 11 years. He said, "The tell is built that deep. It's not a flaw in your technique. It's just information." She said, "And you had it after one exchange." He said, "I watched your hands for about 30 seconds when you were in the crowd before any of this started." She absorbed this. Then she said, "Again." She came with a hook this time, going around the front of the jab, trying to find a line that wasn't carrying the same tell. She had adapted in real time, which was the mark of someone whose training went deeper than memorized sequences. Bruce moved inside the hook, the direction that made the hook's arc irrelevant, and from the inside position, his palm found her ribs. 3 points. 8 seconds total. Willis said, "That's 3. Dana said, "I know what it is." She looked at Bruce. She said, "The hook tell." He said, "Different from the jab. Your right hip loads slightly before the hook, maybe 0.2 of a second." She said, "2 separate tells." He said, "The jab and hook have different initiations. The information is different for each one." She said, "And you read both of them in the first 8 seconds. He said, "The hip was available before we started. I saw it when you were walking onto the floor." She was quiet for a moment. 5,000 people were very quiet with her. She said, "I want to try something." Willis looked at Hartley. Hartley looked at 5,000 people who were not going to find this less interesting if it stopped now. He said, "Go ahead." She came again. This time she tried to throw without the initiation, tried to start from neutral and commit without the preliminary loading that the tells lived in. She was attempting to apply in real time what she had been told about herself, which required her to move differently from how she had moved for 11 years, which was extremely difficult, and she knew it was extremely difficult, and she tried it anyway. The jab was smaller. Bruce noticed the change and acknowledged it. He still read it. His left hand met her jab at the wrist, and his right hand found her chin. Not a strike. A placement, held for a count. She stood with his hand at her chin and looked at him over it. He lowered his hand. She said, "You still saw it." He said, "Smaller. You worked on it in real time. That's not easy." She said, "But you still saw it." He said, "Yes." She said, "How long to change it?" He said, "The jab tell is 11 years deep, 6 months of specific work, aimed at the initiation rather than the technique, before it's meaningfully smaller, longer before it's reliable." She said, "And in that time, my jab is worse." He said, "Yes. The correction costs before it pays." She looked at him. She said, "You called this the right question." He said, "Yes." She said, "Whether what you do works against real resistance." He said, "Yes." She said, "And it does." He said, "In the way we tested it tonight, against someone with your specific training and your specific tells, yes." She said, "Why that qualifier?" He said, "Because real is not the same as universal. What works against your tells works because I could read your tells. A different person with different tells might require different reading. The principle is the same, the application is specific to the person." She was quiet for a moment. Something was happening in her expression that was more complicated than what had been there when she first spoke from the crowd. She said, "I called it a hoax." He said, "Yes." She said, "In front of 5,000 people." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was wrong about that." She said it the way she said everything, directly and without softening it. Not performing the admission. Making it. She looked at the 5,000 people who were watching her. She said, into the arena's natural amplification, the specific acoustic carry of a large space. I called what this man was showing a hoax. I said his partner was cooperating and that real resistance would expose the demonstration. I was wrong. She paused. What he was showing is real. I know that, because I just provided the real resistance I said was missing. She looked back at Bruce. She said, that's all. 5,000 Marines responded. Not with the cheering of a crowd that has watched someone win something, with the specific, sustained response of people who have watched something honest happen in front of them. Subscribe if you're still here. What happens after the arena empties is the part that matters more than anything that happened on the floor. Hartley pulled Bruce aside after the formal conclusion of the demonstration, while the arena was still emptying around them. He said, I need to tell you something. Bruce said, all right. Hartley said, when Merritt spoke from the crowd, my first thought was to shut it down, stop it before it became something I'd have to explain. Bruce said, I know. Hartley said, my second thought was that shutting it down would mean 5,000 people went home, having watched a demonstration, instead of something real. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, I've been running combat training for 16 years. I've watched a lot of demonstrations. I've watched maybe 3 things that were real in the way tonight was real. He said, what's the difference? Bruce said, willingness to be tested. Hartley said, from both sides. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, she tested you, and you tested the situation, and the situation turned out to be genuine. Bruce said, she made the situation genuine. I just responded to what she gave me. Hartley looked at him. He said, I'm going to write something up about tonight, about the specific things you demonstrated in terms of reading initiation rather than technique. I think some of what I watched has direct application to how we train here. Bruce said, the tells specifically. Hartley said, the principle that the tells exist, and that training to read them rather than the technique itself changes the timing of the response. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, that's applicable. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, I'm going to need to describe it technically in a way that works in a training context, something that doesn't depend on having watched Bruce Lee for 30 seconds. Bruce said, break it into observation categories: shoulder initiation, hip loading, head position before entry. Each one gives you different information and requires different attention to develop. The specific thing you're training is attention at a level earlier than the technique itself. Hartley wrote this down. He had been carrying a notebook since they entered the arena and had been using it throughout. Bruce said, the 30 seconds matters. You have to build the attention before it becomes useful in real time. Hartley said, how long? Bruce said, months before it's reliable, but you start getting useful versions of it much earlier if you're specifically training for it. Hartley wrote more. He said, Merritt. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, she's the best close combat practitioner on this base. Has been for 3 years. Bruce said, I know. Hartley said, she told you a hoax in front of 5,000 people. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, and then corrected herself in front of the same 5,000 people. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, and then in day. Bruce said, no. Hartley said, she's going to be better for having done it. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, and then correction, not the fight. Bruce said, the correction. Hartley nodded. He said, I have one more question. Bruce said, ask. Hartley said, when she was in the crowd, before any of this started, you said you watched her hands for 30 seconds and read the hip loading before she ever moved onto the floor. Bruce said, yes. Hartley said, were you already planning for the possibility that she would challenge you? Bruce said, I noticed her stillness. I noticed what the stillness meant. I decided to understand what I was potentially dealing with before I needed to deal with it. Hartley said, preparation. Bruce said, observation. Preparation is what you do with what you observed. Hartley closed his notebook. He said, I'll send you a copy of what I write. Bruce said, I'd like that. They shook hands, and Hartley went to manage the remaining logistics of a 5,000-person event that had become something he hadn't planned for. Dana Merritt was in the corridor outside the arena when Bruce came through. She was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, not blocking his way, just present. She said, the jab tell. He said, yes. She said, 6 months. He said, before it's meaningfully smaller. Longer before it's reliable, she said, and the hip, he said, similar timeline, they're connected. The jab initiation runs through the same weight transfer as the hook initiation. Fixing one affects the other, which can be either helpful or complicated, depending on which way it goes. She said, complicated how? He said, you might fix the jab tell and find the hook tell has become smaller along with it, or you might find that consciously addressing one sends the other deeper. She said, I need honest training partners. He said, people who will call it every time they see it. Not people who will let it go because they don't want to make you feel criticized. She said, that's a specific kind of training partner. He said, uncommon. She said, do you have them? He said, a few. She said, they make you better. He said, they make me honest, which is a prerequisite for better. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor was mostly empty now, the sound of the crowd having dispersed toward wherever 5,000 people went after an afternoon like this one. She said, I spoke before I had information. He said, yes. She said, I do that. He said, a lot of strong people do. Strength becomes a kind of certainty about things outside the specific domain the strength belongs to. She said, you're saying my strength made me confident about things I wasn't actually expert in. He said, yes. She said, that's a fair critique. He said, it's an observation. She said, the same thing. He said, not always. Critiques carry judgment. Observations just carry what they are. She looked at him. She said, you didn't judge me when I called it a hoax. He said, you were giving me information about what you believed and why you believed it. That's useful. I don't judge useful information. She said most people would have. He said, I was more interested in what you'd say after you had more information. She said, and what did I say? He said, something honest. She nodded once. The specific nod of someone who has received something and is filing it properly. She said, come back. He said, what? She said, come back to this base. I want to bring 20 of my best people and have you work through the initiation reading specifically. Not as a demonstration, as training. He said, when? She said, I'll coordinate with Hartley. Can you come back within 6 weeks? He said, probably. She said, probably. He said, check with Hartley. He has my contact. She said, all right. She unfolded her arms. She extended her hand. He shook it. She said, the thing you said to me on the floor, about the tell being 11 years deep. He said, yes. She said, you didn't say that to embarrass me. He said, no. She said, you said it so I would understand why the work was going to take as long as it was going to take. He said, yes. She said, because if I thought it would be quick, I'd lose patience with it. He said, and if you lose patience with it, you won't do it properly. She said, and if I don't do it properly, it won't get smaller. He said, yes. She said, you were thinking about how to help me fix it before I had finished processing the fact that it existed. He said, I noticed it when you were in the crowd. I had time to think about it. She almost smiled. It was the first thing that had been on her face all afternoon that wasn't completely controlled. She said, that's very specific. He said, yes. She said, most people would have been thinking about the challenge. He said, I was thinking about the challenge and about your jab tell simultaneously. They're related, she said. How? He said, the challenge came from certainty. The tell comes from habit. Both of them are things built over a long time that became automatic and therefore invisible to the person they belong to. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that's interesting. He said, what is? She said, that the reason I was wrong about you and the reason you could read me are both the same kind of thing, something that built up over time and stopped being visible. He said, yes. She said, I hadn't thought about that. He said, you would have. She looked at him. She said, you're confident about that. He said, you came out of a crowd of 5,000 people to ask a real question. That's not the behavior of someone who stops at the first layer of things. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, 6 weeks. He said, 6 weeks. She walked back toward the arena. He watched her go, the same quality of movement he had noticed from 20 feet away when he was walking onto the floor. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful, the walk of someone who had been serious about something for a long time. He put his jacket on and walked toward the gate. The note Hartley wrote reached Bruce 3 weeks later. It was 12 pages, specific and well-organized, and it contained a proposed curriculum for incorporating initiation reading into the base's existing close combat training program. It laid out the observation categories Bruce had described, the shoulder initiation and hip loading and head position before entry, and proposed a 6-month training arc for developing reliable attention at that level. It was eventually implemented in modified form across 3 additional training facilities over the following 2 years. The modification came from committee reviews and institutional processes and the various hands that institutional processes run things through, which smoothed some of the specificity out of what Hartley had written, but the core of it survived. The people who worked in those facilities did not know the note traced back to a Thursday afternoon at Camp Lejeune. Institutional documents rarely trace their origins to the specific conversations they came from. Dana Merritt's training group came back in 5 weeks, rather than 6. Hartley had expedited the logistics. 20 people, her best people, spent 2 days working through observation training specifically, developing the attention at the level before technique that Bruce had demonstrated on the arena floor. Dana's jab tell was smaller at the 3-month mark. Noticeably smaller, not gone, smaller. The training partners she had selected, people she had specifically chosen because they would tell her the truth every time they saw it, confirmed this independently. At 6 months, it was smaller still. She never went back to the arena where she had called it a hoax and corrected herself. She didn't need to. The correction had been made in the only place it needed to be made, which was in the same space and in front of the same people who had heard the original statement. She told one person about it years later, a young Marine she was training who had made a public claim about a technique and been shown wrong in front of her unit and was struggling with the aftermath of that. She said, "You said something in front of people without the information to support it. You got shown wrong in front of the same people. That's uncomfortable." The young Marine said, "Yes, Sergeant." She said, "It's also the best thing that can happen to you if you handle it right." The young Marine said, "How do you handle it right?" She said, "You correct it in front of the same people. Without softening it, without making it about anything other than what it is," she said. "Then you go fix the thing that caused you to be wrong," she said, "in that order. The correction first, the fixing second. Don't try to fix it before you've corrected it." The young Marine asked, "How do you know the order matters?" She said, "Because the correction isn't for you, it's for the people who heard the wrong thing. If you fix the thing without correcting it, you've served yourself and not them." She said, "Serve them first, then fix yourself." The young Marine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did something like this happen to you?" Dana said, "Yes." The young Marine said, "What did you do?" Dana said, "I corrected it in front of 5,000 people." The young Marine looked at her. Dana said, "Then I spent 6 months fixing the thing that caused it." She said, "The fixing was easier than the correction." She said, "The correction was the right thing." She left it at that. The young Marine thought about it for several days and eventually asked a clarifying question that Dana answered and from which the young Marine derived something useful. That is how it travels. Not in dramatic public moments, though the moments matter, in corridors and training rooms and the specific conversations that happen between people who have been through something and people who need to understand something. The person who's been through it can help them understand. The jab tell was smaller. After 6 months of honest partners telling her the truth every time, the correction had been made in front of 5,000 people in an arena in North Carolina. The fixing had happened over 6 months, in training rooms with 20 people who were committed to telling her what they saw. Both mattered. The correction was the harder one. She already knew that. Subscribe if this story was worth your time. Tell me in the comments what you think Dana was thinking in the moment between his hand touching her chin and him lowering it. I read every one.